Amber with Alderwood Studio, and today I'm here at Missouri Star Quilt Company to show you how to make my Persephone quilt. The Persephone quilt is really fun to make. It looks like it's pretty complicated, but it's actually pretty simple once you get started. This pattern has 3 different versions, 3 different ways to make it, which I always love to add in patterns. It has a 2-color version, an ombre version, and a fat quarter version. Today we're going to be making this ombre version in the throw size. It also comes in a baby size and a queen size. You can reference your pattern to find the fabric requirements for this quilt. For the ombre version, we're going to be using 8 of these different colored fabrics and then 1 background fabric. There is a template involved in this pattern for the curved block, and that comes with the pattern. Also in the pattern is a coloring page so you can color your own and decide what fabrics you'd like to use. The first step in making the Persephone block is to sew the curved pieces together. I've already cut my fabric out using my templates, and now I'm going to pin my curve and then sew it. So everyone has their own favorite way of pinning and sewing curves, but here's what I like to do. I like to fold each of my curved pieces in half and mark the center, either just by finger pressing it or with a pin. I'll do a pin because it's a little easier to see. So I'm going to fold each of these, mark the center, make sure we know where that center is. Then I'm going to lay the outer curved piece on top of the inner curve and line up those pinned center points and then get that pinned in place. Now I am fairly experienced with curves, so I generally just do 1 more pin, and that is at the very end of the block. I find if I skip this, then I tend to stretch as I'm sewing too much, and this top piece winds up being a bit too long. So I always like this final anchor point. If you are newer to curves or a little bit more anxious about it, you can always add more pins in here as well to keep you on track as you're sewing. So I'm going to go ahead and get this curve all sewn, and then we will trim it. This is a really nice curve to sew if you're newer to this technique because it's a pretty big one and it has a nice gentle curve. It's a lot easier than smaller curves in my opinion, so it's a great starting point. Now with curves, it's always best to go slow, maybe slower even than you think you need to go, because the last thing we want is to wind up with puckers in our fabric and have to go back and seam rip that out. So I always like to stop, lift my foot as needed, and adjust the fabric around to avoid any of those puckers. That last pin out and we're almost done. Okay, now I'm going to press this curve. I always like to press my curves so that the inner curved piece has the seams being pressed towards it. This is for a couple different reasons. It tends to line up better when I'm sewing Drunkard's Path blocks together. Usually there's less seam bulk in the way, but also if your curve is not quite right, if the seam allowance is a little too big or too small, there's a lot more forgiveness if you can press like this, because if you press starting on the curved block and press out towards the external block, it can kind of push the fabric out and hide any imperfections. So I'm just going to press like this. I have what looks like a pucker here, but it's not actually a real pucker, it's just a wrinkle. So I'm just going to ignore that for now. Okay, and now I'm going to show you how to trim this block. I always like to leave all that extra trimming room. So we want to trim this to 8 3/4 inches square. I can see looking at my mat that I've got a good amount of wiggle room here. I like to start my trimming by cleaning up each of these edges here. I like to have a nice, clean, perfect right angle here to start with. And since I know I have plenty of trimming space, I am going to give these edges a little trim first. So I've got this nice, perfectly straight edge now. I'm going to line this up on my mat with a line, and I'm not worrying about the measurements right now. I'm just taking off the tiniest amount that I can to get a nice even edge here. Okay, so now we've cleaned up the corner of the white part of this curve, and now I'm going to lay this out using those nice straight edges as my guides. And now I'm going to trim this block down to the appropriate size, which is again 8 3/4 inches. It always pays to kind of take a minute to make sure everything is nice and straight before you start trimming. So then we wind up with this really nice, perfectly square block. So we're going to set this aside for just a minute and gather some other pieces. For this pattern, I'm going to refer to the pieces by their label. So in the pattern, all of the pieces have labels in the cutting chart, and that makes it a lot easier to refer to them as you move forward. So the next pieces that we need are A1 and A2. And we're going to pay close attention to the orientation of our curved block for our next few steps to make sure that it stays in the right spot. So A1 and A2 are going to be sewn to the edges of this block, just like this. We're going to sew one to the side and one to the top. Okay, so we've sewn our two A pieces on here, and now I'm going to press these. You have some flexibility in how you decide to press this, but I like pressing these to the side. So I am going to just press it towards the background fabric here. There we go. And now we're going to set this block aside for just a moment while we do another step. Next we need our B1 and A3 pieces. Now this part is a little tricky just to make sure that you're doing things in the right orientation. We need to make sure that we are putting our pieces together in the correct order. So we are going to be putting these together the same way you would for a mitered binding seam. So in this case, what that means is we're going to lay out our A3 piece and put our B1 piece over the top. And then we're going to do the same thing mirrored on the other side. So we're going to lay this piece out, lay this over the top. Now we're going to be sewing right along this edge so that we have this nice little pointed piece. We're creating these pieces right here. So before we sew these, I'm going to draw a diagonal line on each of these blue pieces to make sure that we stitch right along the perfect line. So I'm going to lay my ruler down here, and I'm going to make sure that it's beginning at this point and ending at the intersection of this white background piece and the blue piece. And I'm going to draw a nice little diagonal line here. If you feel comfortable sewing this corner to corner without the line, you can absolutely do that. But if you're a little unsure, having that line can make sure you get a really good precise seam. We're going to do that on this other side too, and you will do this with all of these pieces. Okay, now I'm going to sew these. I'm going to be careful to do this one at a time, and I'm going to pin them so I don't lose the orientations here. It's a really common mistake to flip these the wrong way, so I want to be extra careful. I'm going to pin that one there and this one here. Now we're going to sew right along these blue lines, and then we're going to trim and press these once they're all done. other one. All right. Now before we press, we're going to trim these corners off here. So we're going to take our ruler and trim about 1/4 inch away from that seam towards the corner. And now we can see that this will open up just like we want it to. Do the same thing with this one. Okay, now I'm going to press these to the dark side. So I'm going to open these pieces up and press towards the blue fabric here. Oops, I got a little pucker in mine, so I'm going to just redo that there. Now I can see that I did not quite catch my corner on this side. The fabric slipped a little bit as I was sewing it, and I was really hoping that that wouldn't be an issue, but it slipped, and I'm just going to move on and allow that to be captured in the seam allowance. Okay, we've finished our pieces, and now these pieces have a bit of trimming space in them. We're going to trim these down, starting on the blue side, so that they measure 9.5 inches. Yours may not need to be trimmed down. I've left a bit of extra space in case that our seam allowances are a little bit bigger than we're expecting, or we lose more from the length than we're expecting. So we can trim this down to 9.5. All right, so we're gonna trim that there. And now we are going to grab our B2 and B3 pieces. Now our B2 and B3 pieces look very similar, but one is just a little bit wider. And we want to make sure that as we're sewing this next step, we're paying close attention to where we're putting the B2 piece and where we're putting the B3 piece. So I'm going to lay my pieces out very carefully here. And we are going to put our B3 piece on the outside of these pieces. It's where the white, where the background fabric is at its tallest point. That side gets a B3 piece. The other side, we're going to sew a B2 piece. So this is one of those times where it's really good to lay out your fabric pieces, reference your pattern, and make sure you're getting them on the right sides. So I'm going to sew these together. We're going to have two groups, two blocks here, and then these are going to go onto our main block. Okay, now we are going to press these. I like to press these B2 and B3 pieces away from the seam like this. we go. Okay. So now we can add these units to our main block, and this is a good time to take a pause, look at our pattern, and see what orientation these go in. A good way to remember how these get sewn on is the smaller B piece gets attached to this little white piece. That's how I like to remember it. So I'm going to sew this piece onto here, and then I'm going to reserve this one and wait a moment because we're going to add something else to this piece before we sew it onto the main block. Now we're going to press this. I am going to press this to the dark side. This one you really could press either way. You can even press it open if you want, but I'm going to go ahead and press it away from the white. So here we go. Now when we get to this stage, I find that no matter how precise I am when I'm sewing all this together, it's still really common for me to wind up with some kind of slightly uneven edges here. It's totally fine to leave those if you want, or you can trim it down. I have had success both ways. I would, for instance, probably trim this edge a bit, and I'm going to do that now just to make it a little bit more even. And then if that winds up impacting our measurements a little bit later on, we can just trim a little bit further if we need to. I don't really think it will. It's a really small amount. I'm just kind of cleaning up that edge a little bit to make it easier when we're sewing these blocks together. Now we're going to be making these squares. Now if you are making the 2-color queen or throw version, you will be strip piecing part of this. We're not doing that, so I'm going to show you how to make each individual square. So we're going to be using our B6, A6, and A7 pieces for this part. This is a really simple little square. It looks tricky because the pieces are small, but if you just go slow, pay close attention to your seam allowance, you'll be completely fine. We're going to just be sewing the A6 pieces to the B6, and then we'll sew the A7 pieces to each side. This is one of those times when it really pays to carefully line up your pieces. Make sure your seam allowance is really good and go slow. We've got our nice little square. Now we're going to take our B4 and B5 pieces and add them just to one side of this square. So we're just adding a little corner padding here. I'm going to sew this piece on first, and then I'll add the other one on. Okay, now we'll press this. And again, going to press away from the blue square in the middle there. Okay, now we're going to add this cute little block to the unit that we reserved earlier. Now this is another case where we want to pay close attention to how we're lining things up. I like to remember the right orientation for this by thinking that this corner should be pointing all the way towards the other white piece. I don't know if that helps you or not, but it helps me. We want to have the extra padding underneath here. So we're going to sew this together right here. Okay, so I'm going to press this to the side. I'm pressing this towards the blue fabric. Okay, and now we're getting pretty close. This is my favorite part of this pattern, is putting these two together. So now we're going to sew these pieces together, and I like to use some pins on this one. I like to pay close attention to where this point is here. We want these 2 points to align nicely. And this pattern has so many seams that it's really easy to get slightly off. This is a good time to make sure everything is lining up. And if you wind up a little short on one side or the other, we can trim that down. We just really want this particular point to line up nicely. So I'm going to tuck those together. My seams are nesting, which is lovely, and put a little pin in here. Okay. Now I personally like to press this particular seam open because I just want this point to be super crisp. So I'm going to go ahead and do that back here. And whenever I press something from the back, I always like to flip it over afterwards and press it from the front as well, so it gets that really nice flat feel to it. Okay, look at that. We're so close to finishing this block up. We just have one more step. We need to get our A4 and A5 rectangles, and this is just kind of that final little border you see around the top of each block. So we're going to sew one to each side, just like this, and then this will be finished. Okay, now we're just going to press these. I'm going to press these away from the block. Now these blocks have a lot of different seams, a lot of stuff going on, and there is absolutely no problem with needing to trim your block up a little bit when you get to the end of it. As long as your blocks are a consistent size, you can trim them down to get nice crisp edges all you want. So I am going to do a little trim on this block myself because I just want to clean up this other edge a little bit. I'm not going to trim a lot off, just a tiny bit, just to straighten it out a little bit. All you have to do is once you trim a block or two, just measure them and keep an eye on what their measurements are so you can be consistent throughout. Now, because this quilt is created on point, we're going to slice a few of our blocks vertically and horizontally. So you'll be able to see in your pattern, in the layout, which blocks need to be sliced across horizontally and which need to be sliced vertically. It'll depend on your layout and which fabrics you've chosen. I'm going to show you how to do that on this block without actually cutting it, but I'm going to show you how I would line up the cut. Because this block has a lot of corners, it can be a little bit tricky to get the perfect vertical cut. So how I approach this is I start by lining my ruler up with each corner and then seeing where that falls with the other corners within the block. You can see in my block that there are parts where that doesn't line up perfectly with a point. That's okay. We're just going to move our ruler around until we get what feels like the best option. When we're binding our quilt, we're going to be covering a lot of this up anyways, so it's not a big deal if some of your corners aren't perfect. Now for the other cut, for the horizontal cut, that's a lot easier because you're just lining up your ruler corner to corner. You don't have to worry about lining it up with anything inside the block at all, and you can just slice right there. So you'll notice that for each color for this size, you're making 3 blocks. Depending on how you've laid out your blocks vertically, that will determine which rows you need to cut. So for every other color, you will cut a vertical piece. This piece does not need any cuts. This piece does. And for your starting color, for the first color you choose on the bottom, every single block will be cut horizontally. There is a very handy chart in the pattern that tells you exactly how to do this. It will tell you how many blocks that need to be cut for each color, and it'll be pretty easy to visualize once you take a look at that and lay everything out. Thank you so much for joining me to make this Persephone quilt. I just love this fun blue ombre that we have here. It's so soothing, so relaxing. I'm going to show you a couple other versions of this pattern that I've also made. This is one of my favorites. This is one of my favorite quilts I've ever made, actually. This is all made using a looser woven fabric, so it's nice and soft. And I really love how the colors move from kind of a plummy color through more orange up to peachy pinks. It's just a really fun color combination. I think you can tell that I really love making this pattern in the ombre version. I also have a fun example made with prints. A lot of people see patterns like this and think, I love that, but I'd like to be able to make it with prints. Will it look good with prints? And I think this pattern translates really nicely with prints. And this one is made using my own Garden Dreams fabric collection from Riley Blake. And you can see we still have the ombre effect going on in this quilt, but with prints instead. Thanks again for joining me today to make this Persephone quilt at Missouri Star. Again, my name is Amber from Alderwood Studio, and I'd love for you to follow along with me to make more ombre quilts.